congregational prayer. So I'm missing the opportunity to share words of Torah with you in person. I would say this is the most unusual circumstance from which I've had the opportunity to speak to Darchei Noam, except it's not. For the veteran members who may remember March of 1981, when I first came to Darchei Noam to interview, I delivered my first Devar Torah to the congregation in the diet workshop. So this is a big improvement in many ways in terms of it's a little calmer, it's a little more spacious, and it's a disadvantage in the sense that even crowded into the diet workshop as we were that morning, we were together in the same space. And among the many things we pray this year is that come this season next year in good health for all of us, we should be able to gather together in the same place again. That said, I'd like to offer the teaching for this morning at this time in our service and begin with a story. A few years ago, Barbara and I were in line at Pearson Airport waiting to clear security for our flight home to Philadelphia. Having made this trip many times during our 20 years of high holidays with Darchei Noam, we were accustomed to the routine. This time, however, I was asked to step out of line so the security agent could go through my backpack. Having already removed the usual items, I could not imagine what had provoked his concern. And then he pulled out my set of keys, one for the car, two for the house, and if you are like me, the one that you keep, even though you have no idea what door it opens. But I had forgotten that attached to my key ring was a very small penknife. The tiny blade was only suitable for small tasks, such as cutting out classified ads from the newspaper, which is what my father used it for back when I was a child and he ran a personnel agency. I had attached that little penknife to my key ring years ago, not because I needed to cut ads out of newspapers, but because it had once belonged to my father. That little knife had inadvertently passed through a lot of security checks over the years without being detected as dangerous, including at Pearson. I was once invited to the presidential Hanukkah reception during the Obama administration. And while not a great tribute to the White House security system, my key ring with that penknife sailed through the security scanner without setting off an alarm. Well, whatever compassion he might have felt about my family heirloom, the Pearson security attendant had to follow protocol. That penknife was not going on the flight to Philadelphia. He did kindly offer me the option of going back out through security, addressing an envelope to myself, dropping the knife in the envelope, paying for the postage, and then going back through security. But given the hour, that option would likely have resulted in our missing our flight home. So with great reluctance and significant sadness, I handed over my father's penknife and we were waved through. In surrendering possession according to Jewish law, I also surrendered ownership. I knew there was no chance of my ever recovering my father's penknife. It had become what is called in Hebrew, yeush, which means ownerless. It means that the connection between an object and its owner has been severed. There are complicated conversations in Jewish law about how property is declared ownerless and who gets to make such determinations. The person who loses an item, the person who finds an item, but the determining factor is the emotional experience of the original owner, whether she or he has given up hope that what has been lost is not coming back. So imagine if instead of being confiscated, your penknife slips out of your pocket in the airport. You don't realize it's missing until you return home. The odds of your ever seeing that knife again are remote. You will likely consider it gone. If you know the Hebrew, you'll see it's yeush, although that may not be the first word that comes to mind when you realize it is missing. So friends, in these first 7 months of living, with the restrictions, frictions, and constrictions of the coronavirus, who has not had some experience of loss? There are so many things that we took for granted that have been upended, suspended, and need to be mended. To name but a few, the loss of everyday activities that frame and shape our lives, the loss of expansive experiences such as theater, music, recreation, and travel, the loss of direct participation with the communities of which we are a part, the loss of the ways in which we are accustomed to going to work, the loss of in-class education for our children and our grandchildren, the loss of being able to share familiar rituals of celebration and of sorrow, the loss of human contact, of seeing family and of seeing friends. Well, I acknowledge that on balance, it's a somewhat privileged place from which to complain. There have been over 10,000 COVID-related deaths in Canada, nearly 200,000 in the United States, approaching 1 million around the world. And there have been economic implosions that have cost jobs and put lives at risk. Around the world and around the corner, there are people who would be grateful for even a percentage of the safety and security many, if not most of us enjoy, even as we live within the parameters of this pandemic. Many of the losses I mentioned are closer to disappointment than they are to catastrophe, although understandably some are more consequential. And yet, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, our losses are real, and they remain a difficult challenge. Placing them in a larger context does not diminish their significance. The deferral of the things we had planned, the suspensions of routines to which we have become accustomed, the lost time that we will not recover, these are all real. They are all disruptive. They are all difficult. They are all distressing. And common to each of these losses is the anxiety about not knowing when or even if these things will come back. Or to put it in terms of Jewish law, whether the things we have lost have metaphorically become yeush, things about which we have abandoned hope of recovery, things that we assume are lost and will not again be found. But while yeush functionally means ownerless, that's not how the word translates. Yeush literally means despair. It is about people and not about property. The despair that is yeush in Jewish tradition is an emotional experience of hopelessness, a hopelessness that is combined with the existential experience of a sense of finality. And that was my state of mind at the airport when my father's penknife passed into the hands of a stranger. These experiences have become familiar to many of us at some point during these past months. We know the emotional despair of hopelessness as our world constricts around us. We know the despair of finality when it feels like what is gone is never coming back. The kind of despair that we have experienced is not about losing a penknife. It is what the Talmud calls zuto shel yam, what Rabbi Ari Hart describes in an online article as, quote, something so massive and disruptive to all of human life that it bestows despair on anything it encounters, close quotation. We are gathered together on this Rosh Hashanah in such a time, globally, nationally, individually. We have endured the disruptive undulations of the past 7 months as we have faced the challenges and the confusions and the complications of navigating through this pandemic. Add to our COVID crisis an economic upheaval, political disruptions, environmental devastation, and the surfacing of a long overdue reckoning with systemic racism, and the hopelessness that we often feel is understandable and can at times be overwhelming. So what shall we do this year with Rosh Hashanah? Here it is again with its persistent promise of renewal and its insistent affirmation of possibility. Our spiritual challenge as this new year begins is to keep the understandable moments of despair from becoming the definitive condition of despair, from becoming yeush. To acknowledge our emotional experiences of loss, yes, without yielding to the absolute abandonment of hope. And I make no pretense that this is easy work. Pundits, prophets, and prognosticators have been pronouncing doom for months, telling us what has been irretrievably lost, what will never be the same, what is gone forever, and what is not coming back. But despite the definitive predictions about post-pandemic life, we actually do not know what things will look like when this pandemic begins to wind down and then taper off and then finally is tamed. And while inevitably some things may get lost, others may be found. A world after COVID is as likely to be a world of both and as of either or before and after. We will be grateful, for example, when we can again gather in the home of a mourner during Shiva to share comfort and consolation. But we will also now be able to share those moments long distance through the online portals that we have learned to appreciate and to which we will have become accustomed. Rosh Hashanah is called in Hebrew Yom Harat Olam, which is usually rendered as the day the world is born. But I learned from Rabbi Gordon Tucker in the name of his teacher, Rabbi Gerson Cohn, that a more accurate translation of Yom Harat Olam is, today is a day pregnant with possibility. But as every parent knows, the future never unfolds precisely the way we think it will. Despite all of the distress, these times through which we are living remain pregnant with possibility. Every definitive assumption we imagine about the future will be challenged by the unanticipated, unforeseen, and unknowable circumstances through which we have yet to live and the changes we have yet to see. The durable and eternal work of Rosh Hashanah has been and always will be teshuvah, repairing relationships, redirecting our lives when they have wandered off course, and returning to paths of godliness in a world that so desperately needs the best from each of us. But this year, the work of Rosh Hashanah has an additional urgency. We will have to work hard not to let the understandable feelings of despair of these past months become a definitive state of despair, to become yeush. That is the despair of surrender, the despair of finality, and the despair that comes from abandoning hope. We are challenged instead to resist letting these very real, deep, disturbing, and often depressing moments of despair steal from us the experiences of joy, celebration, happiness, and connection that we have known and that we miss in this season of isolation, and that can, and we hope will, return in the future. And against the despair that comes from feeling weary and feeling powerless, we are challenged to seek moments of resilience and of resolution, and of courage and of confidence, to be ready for the work of repair and of improvement that surely lies in front of us. Perhaps in this difficult season, finding moments of meaning and cultivating confidence may seem to be tasks of messianic proportions. Perhaps. But among the wisest teachings of Jewish spiritual tradition is that the Messiah never arrives, but is still always on the way. Particularly on this Rosh Hashanah, we are again invited to be what the biblical prophet Zechariah once called the Jewish people over 2,000 years ago, when he named us Asirei HaTikvah, prisoners of hope. And so may we be. Shana Tova.